You will attempt what has become known as the walk. Dice will be rolled to determine your skill, stamina, and luck scores.
Take a breath and jump deep in, if your trial you hope to win.
Death Trap Dungeon.
Oh, well, it's been an exciting day so far, hasn't it? And of course, today wouldn't be finished unless we had an interview with the main man himself, Ian Livingstone. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you very much, Ollie. How are you?
I'm very well. You don't need a long introduction because everyone knows who you are. So it's, well, they don't. They should do. If you don't, you shouldn't be here. Right. So, Ian, you're very kindly giving up some of your time from your holiday, and it was 38 years ago today, on the 27th of August, that you released the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Now, firstly, something just sprung to my mind. Why did you release it at the end of a summer holiday?
Well, it wasn't our decision. It was Penguin Books' decision. And the whole process had been a long and drawn-out affair. I mean, this had been going on since 1979 when Steve and I, when we used to own Games Workshop, run these events called Games Day, and at Games Day 79, Penguin Books had a stand there, and an amazing editor called Joe was at Games Day launching another of her books and was fascinated by all the people playing D&D and other role-playing games at Games Day, and she said to Steve and I, maybe you consider writing a how-to book, a how-to role-play book. And we said yes. We say yes to anything, of course,
yeah.
these days. And she said, okay, send in a synopsis. And when Steve and I started to talk about it, I thought, well, rather than having a book that tells you how to play, why not write a book that gives you an experience of playing to create effectively a single-player role-playing adventure where the book replaces the Dungeon Master. But it took then well over a year for generally to get any traction with the Penguin management, and whether it was going to be a Penguin book or a Puffin book, they couldn't decide. And some of their management team laughed so hard that that their head apparently hit the desk. They laughed at the idea of an interactive book because they had no concept that anything other than linear book could ever be successful.
Yeah.
Having an interactive book with a game system on top made it even more a ludicrous proposition. So it was a long, drawn-out affair, a year to get it through the approvals process, and another year for us to write it, and then we had a battle with the Puffin design team about which artists we should use. They wanted all nice, safe artists that kind of have a gnome and a little toadstool and little butterflies on the cover. And we wanted terrifying beasts that threatened to rip the faces off the readers because of all our work with Games Workshop and White Dwarf magazine. Anyway, to their credit, they said okay. And it just so happened that they wanted to publish for the going back to school term for kids, and so thus the 27th of August was the date, and we were very excited when it happened.
Fantastic. And the initial reaction, did it sell well immediately? Was it
No, not at all. I mean, the Penguin, and well, it was published on the Puffin label because they finally decided it's going to be for children, so they thought 8 to 12-year-olds was the right age for it.
Yeah.
And they didn't really know what to do with it. There was not much of a marketing budget. Steve and I did what we could to promote it through White Dwarf magazine, but there was no marketing budget per se. So they just kind of plonked in bookshops, and they looked like every other book. But it wasn't until Barry Cunningham, who was the marketing director, managed to get us onto Radio 1 that things really happened. And it was a session where listeners could phone in and make the decisions as we read out the book, and then that just kind of launched it nationwide. So being from a nothing event to a sudden nationwide craze happened in a very short period of time. And they repented several times because they still didn't believe in the Warlock Firetop Mountain until finally Geraldine very proudly was able to come on the phone and said, I think we need 2 more.
Yeah.
So Steve then wrote Chaos and I wrote Forest of Doom.
So when you were creating the world of Alancia, when did that come in? Was that at the beginning, or did that come in a little bit later in the books when you started to flesh it out and start doing the maps? And
It came about much later to kind of have a distinct world in which the books could be cited and have a geography and lore and a currency and places and people that were consistent. As in most role-playing games, it's nice to have a consistent universe. And so that evolved over time until we finally got a map drawn, and I said, well, this is Anvil, and this is where Firetop Mountain is, and we'll put Darkwood Forest there because that's where Forest of Doom is, and then we'll put Steve's Dark Tower over here for Sizzle of Chaos, and then okay, well, we need a coastline now because we've got City of Thieves, so we drew the map so more black sand can be plonked on the map, and it just kind of grew out of that from a kind of not a random map, but it was created as on the fly after the event, so to speak, and not until there's a few books were published that we managed to put this world together in the form of Valencia, and then the whole continent of Titan. And the idea was most of the fancy books that Steve and I wrote were based in Valencia, and then he had old Sorcerer and Cool for the Presents books later on when we couldn't actually keep up with the demand.
When obviously you are still writing them as well. There's a bit of a break, wasn't there? And then you've come back and written a couple more over the last few years. And is it like visiting an old friend, or is it comforting to go back in that world?
Fighting Fantasy is a very emotional thing for us. We've been doing it since 1982. We started writing in 1981, and we've created a world that we're very fond of, and we've delighted other people being able to play their part in helping build the world, both artists, and we use some amazing artists in the series, and guest authors who've created their own adventures inside our world, and that's been very, very, very satisfying. So it's a journey. We've created characters and creatures and places that are almost like a second home, as it were, and we're particularly fond of that world. Yeah.
And do you see it running for many years to come? Can you see an end to it at all?
Well, I think we might end before it ends. We have no intention of ever giving up on Fighting Fantasy. It's the 40th anniversary in 2022. There'll definitely be a new book for that monumental date. It survived the test of time in the same way, obviously not as big as, but James Bond has survived the test of time. And when one generation starts passing it down to the next generation, that resonates with people on a long-term basis. So there's no reason why it can't carry on throughout time, with parents passing on to their children passing on to their children.
So, it's almost, it gets reinvented, isn't it?
I'm very proud of that.
And technology's come in as well, so you've obviously had computer games in the 80s with it, and new apps that using Death Trap Dungeon, and there's obviously audio, and there's so many different places it can go. I'm sure you'd love to have a TV series or a film or something set in the land. And
well, there's definitely been lots of people approach us over the years to do more than just apps and video games. There's been a screenplay written for Death Trap Dungeon. There's a couple of options flying around at the moment for possible silver screen adaptations of one or more of the books. There's an enduring love of Fighting Fantasy. I meet so many people now who kind of not revert to childhood, but they have a moment when they realise that you had written some of the books that they read as a child that had impacted so strongly on their imaginations, and that's really gratifying to hear that. But as I say, it wasn't an intention beyond Firetop Mountain to build this world, but it has grown, and as I said earlier, largely as well down to the amazing artists we used. The cover of Wall of Firetop Mountain originally by Peter Andrew Jones, lavishly illustrated by Russ Nicholson, absolutely iconic artwork. And then, for my own part, getting Ian McCaig to do the covers of 4 of my books: Death Trap Dungeon, Forest of Doom, City of Thieves, and Island of Lizard King, and the internal illustrations for Death Trap and City of Thieves. Ian McCaig is an absolute legend.
Charlie Higson was just saying that he picked up City of Thieves as his first one, and we both agreed it was the cover that just absolutely sort of pushed the edge of any sort of children's literature.
And it's amazing to have Dan Barbone looking so threateningly hideous on the front of a child's book. There's a triumph that we managed to get that past the puppet editors. And of course, Ian McCaig went on to work for George Lucas, and he created Darth Maul. And I like to think that Zan Barbone on the cover of City of Thieves is a kind of distant cousin of Darth Maul, given they both have spiked craniums.
Yeah, I think that was definitely something that was reused for the right reason. Now, obviously, there was one book which we did last year, The House of Hell. I mean, that was probably the most extreme at the time, when people were saying that role-playing and Dungeons and Dragons were a way of people getting into sort of devil worship and things. Releasing House of Hell, obviously Steve's book, was a very brave decision. I mean, how did that come about? That decision to actually publish it.
Steve always wanted to experiment outside of the traditional fantasy genre. So whilst I stuck most of my books into Alancia, Steve was always wanted to try new worlds. So he did Starship Traveller with science fiction. He did Appointment with Fear, superheroes. Creature of Havoc, where you play the creature, and of course House of Hell, which is a kind of modern day fantasy horror book. And so it was again a great achievement to get the Puffin division to have published. But Final Fantasy was not without its controversy. I mean, when they were published at the time, you'd think it'd be a good thing that what we were doing, and the whole generation of children reading. Really playing to their imagination and getting creative writing and algorithmic thinking, and great for reluctant readers, all these great things. Apart from being entertained, games, a game book was actually very good for them, kind of give you meta skills of learning and creativity in multiple ways. And yet they were criticized heavily at the time. The Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide about them, saying because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, you're bound to get possessed by the devil. A worried housewife in deep suburbia phoned her local radio station, said, having read one of her books, her son levitated. The local vicar at Penguin Books threatened to chain himself to the railings of Penguin Books until they were banned. There were petitions sent in by worried parents saying their children are using their imaginations too much. There was articles out about them, and they were negatively. At the same time, it was proven that they're actually increased literacy by nearly 20%.
Wow.
But the fear of this word game used to send people to an apoplectic frenzy, that somehow game trivializes any experience, particularly a reading experience. And yet, they were the bedrock for most people's learning experience through reading.
Yes, I'm sure now if you're a parent and you see your kids on the computer at the moment, you'll probably say, I'd rather them read this book, or these fighting fantasy books, because they're much better for the mind, I think. Obviously in the game world as well, but I know most of these guys watching at the moment.
My mind, very positive. I mean, if you compare your prejudice against one or two titles that should be played by children anyway, and think cognitively what you're happening when you're playing a game, in the same way as fighting fantasy, you're problem solving. You cannot get through a video game or fighting fantasy without problem solving. You're learning intuitively. You're not punished for making a mistake. You're encouraged to try again. You're being creative, and you're effectively solving management simulations when you play video games. I mean, there's so many good things to say about play in whatever form it takes that I think one day perhaps they won't be seen as evil.
No, that's it. I remember reading in one of the old newspapers in the 80s that you did a Fist audio telephone adventure. Remember, how did that come about? Because that was very unusual at the time.
It was, yes. It was, again, in the late 80s, early, maybe 1990, I can't remember exactly when. But Steve did one called Fist, which was a fancy adventure using a premium telephone line. And I did a War of Wizards game, which is basically dueling wizards.
Yes.
So you used effectively a premium number to make decisions over the phone, run by a central server. It was very, very rudimentary, but quite successful for what it was.
Well, how did you get into the actual computer gaming industry? Where was the transition? And
for me, well, it really started with Death Trap Dungeon. It was number one in the bestsellers list in 1984. It was a monumental success, runaway hit all over the place, and running Games Workshop at the time. And two guys came knocking at the door of Workshop, Mark Straw and Dominic Wheatley, who just founded a new games company video games company called Dermog, and they asked if I would design their launch product, which is called Eureka. And Eureka had a £25,000 prize attached to it for the first person to solve the mystery. So it was programmed in Hungary for secrecy, and ultimately a guy won, and he worked out a phone number. When you dial that number, it went to a solicitor's office to a recorded. He left a recorded message on the machine, and presenting that 25 grand check to the guy on TV. So at the time, it was 1984, I just rather take it raw, as I took equity in the company. And when we sorted out a workshop in 1991, I joined Domark, invested a bit more, and then 2 years later, we started to merge several companies. Long story short, we created IDOS PLC in 1995, floated on the stock exchange, and I became executive chairman of the company, and then we launched some huge titles like Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, Hitman, and Deus Ex. So I kind of jumped ship after setting out a workshop. But we were no strangers to video games. We used to sell, Ataris, Activision games in the shops, Games Workshop stores in the early 80s. And I remember quite well the console meltdown in 1983 with all the overstocks. That was the trying time for workshops. So we decided we'd just stick to our traditional fare of White Dwarf role-playing games and ultimately Citadel Miniatures and Warhammer. But throughout this, of course, Final Fantasy powered on.
Yeah, you must be very proud of Tomb Raider, in particularly, being part of the creation of the team. How did that come about?
For designing Tomb Raider, that was a company called Core Design who we bought as IDOS, and I was part of the team that launched Lara Croft, and effectively was like a guiding father for Lara throughout her first 10 or so years.
Yeah. So what was the thinking? What was your part in it? How did it? Just part of the team, or how did you guide it? Were you part of the story development and the look? Or?
No, it was developed by Core Design in Derby.
Yeah.
And a very small team, and most games at that time, video games, were 2D side-scrolling games. So they created some incredible technology with a 3D character and a 3D world, so you watch the character moving into the screen. And so not only was it an incredible character, it was the very first game with a 3D character was a female, so it had all the kind of hallmarks of a great game in terms of the technology was beyond its time. The graphics were amazing. It had this camera angle as well that allowed stuff to happen back in those days that were not happening at all anywhere else in any other game. It had all the hallmarks of great gameplay in terms of exploration, combat, and puzzle solving, and it was phenomenal. And then became a global blockbuster, and we licensed the movie rights to Paramount, and I got to meet Angelina Jolie a couple of times on the sets. She was an amazing character. Not only was she a wonderful looking person, but she was also incredibly intelligent and just very warm, empathetic creature.
Do you have anything to do with Tomb Raider now? Rhianna Pratchett was saying that she met you when you were sort of talking about it beforehand, and she is working on the rise of Tomb Raider. And I think
I left IDOS when it was acquired by Square Enix in 2013. We'd acquired a few years before that by Square Enix of Japan, but I left in 2013. I wasn't really cut out for Japanese corporate culture, so I started investing in the studios and starting over in a different world of video games. I'm now chairman of another public company, Sumo Group, based in Sheffield, and opening a school and still writing Final Fantasy Gamebooks. I was very pleased with Assassins of Valencia that came out last year, and I'm making a few notes for the next one.
There's a message from Jam asking about whether it's a bit of a spoiler actually, because it's the end of the book, about whether that character is also the same character that enters Deathtrap Dungeon. I hope that doesn't spoil it too much.
There's a bit of a timing issue with this about what came first, Deathtrap Dungeon or Assassins of Valencia. But you do meet the same character in both. From the Barbarian, he helps you in Assassins, and he helps you in Deathtrap. But unfortunately, my twisted mind made you fight him to the death. There's only one person to survive Deathtrap Dungeon, and it's your choice whether you're going to let him win or you win.
I've got Ken, who's asking about Talisman and your part in sort of bringing that out in Games Workshop. Still going now, obviously.
Workshop started life with really distributors of Dungeons and Dragons. We'd ordered 6 copies way back in 1975, and on the back of the order, we got a European distribution agreement for 3 years, exclusive, that is. And so we started off life as D&D distributors, and then later publishers. We opened Games Workshop retail shops, the first one being in Hammersmith in 1978. But at the end of that 3-year period, TSR, the owners of Dungeons and Dragons, wanted to merge Games Workshop with their company. But Steve and I were pretty independent, young, and we didn't fancy having to spend half our time in the States and also losing total control of workshops. So we said no to the merger proposition and realized we needed to get some of our own products out there as well as being distributors now on a non-exclusive basis of Dungeons and Dragons. So we set about launching our own range of board games, and in 1983 we had the opportunity to publish Talisman, who'd been invented by Bob Harris, who contacted us. He came down from Scotland to visit us, and 4 of us played it: Albie Fiore, Bob Williams, myself, and one other, can't remember. Oh yes, Bob himself, of course. And we played on a very flimsy piece of paper, kind of papered card standees. But we saw what a great game it was in itself. And so we'd almost effectively signed it on the spot. I think we launched it in 1983, the green box version. But there was a second edition that came out about a year or so later that became the kind of fans' favourite. And still in print today, although not by Workshop. It's licensed, because Workshop only publishes its own IP. So obviously Workshop's 100% focused on Warhammer and Warhammer 40k.
Is there a board game that you're particularly proud of yourself that you designed?
Well, I've designed several board games. I think probably the one that's been the most fun and that people enjoy was the Judge Dredd board game. It came out, I think, I can't remember now, 81, something like that. And that was kind of a fun romp around Mega City 1, and used all the artwork from the comic and had some pretty good fun jokes in there. The most terrible character being Judge Death, and we got him being able to litter. You got arrested for littering rather than killing people. So it was a fun, tongue-in-cheek.
I remember playing it. It's a great game. Is there any chance of that one coming out again or being republished?
Yeah, watch this space, actually. That's a very interesting question. So,
yeah, you know Jason.
Yes, I know Jason.
who of course brought his own game book out. I don't know where I put it now, but the Steel Eye game book, which from Ladybird, I believe. So obviously you've got a lot of projects on at the moment. Is there anything that you're excited about that you can tell us today? And think doesn't have to be game book related, although that would be nice.
Well, I'm planning a board game for fun at the moment, based in kind of medieval times. I do like that period, and I'm trying to get a game that suits our games group. I've been running this board games group since the 80s, with Steve Jackson's in it and Peter Moyer, the very well-known video games designer, a lot of other friends, and it's like a spoof gentleman's club. I'm secretary of the Games Night Club, and we keep a record of all the scores of every meeting and allocate points for that at the end of the year, tally up the points total, and the winner gets the Pagoda Cup for the year, named after the road I used to live in. And but we're at our kind of advanced age now. We can't hack the really tough games these days. So I'm trying to design a game that's kind of mid-core that suits our aging brains. So the kind of games we play these days are Ticket to Level, Ticket to Ride, Splendor, Small World. Nothing too brain achy, but nothing too trivial.
Yeah.
So it's going to be pitched to that kind of mid-core level. So that's kind of a hobby I enjoy. I say I'm tinkering around with ideas for my next, possibly Fighting Fantasy Gamebook, and I'm working, of course, with all my kind of portfolio companies in video games on some of their up and coming releases. But for me, life is a game. I'm never going to retire. I just work and play is the same for me, whether it's video games, board games, Final Fantasy game books. I just totally love my time spent doing it, and don't like doing. Would never dream of doing anything else because I couldn't do anything else.
No, that's fantastic. I've got a few people asking how Steve's doing, whether he's got a book that he's writing at the moment.
Yeah, it's been working. I wouldn't say at lightning speed on this book, but I still see him very regularly, and he is definitely making progress, albeit very slow. I think, there could be 1 or 2 game books out in 2022 for the 40th. We'll have to see how it goes.
Oh, that'd be
You've
good.
got to give us a break. We're both ancient beings.
I was going to say, Rihanna Pratchett, I think she took about 4 months to write hers from beginning to end, and just planning, and then I think she said about two or 3 weeks to write the actual content of it.
Well, obviously writing one is harder than people think, but in the early days, we were under so much pressure from Puffin. Once they realised they had a hit on their hands, that they were wanting them 4 or 5 a year, and it was incredibly difficult times for us in many ways, when we were writing them all ourselves. We were running Games Workshop during the day, going back to our respective homes and writing fighting game books till 1 or 2 in the morning. But we were young then; we could handle it. Not anymore.
Yeah. Now I've got some questions that I'm just going to quickly ask you. This is Jacob Eagle. Good name. My son wants to know if you played the board game Clank or Clank Legacy. How do you feel about legacy board games?
I'm afraid I don't know Clank. I've got over 1,000 board games at home, but I don't have Clank. So I'm afraid I'm unable to answer that question.
Oh, okay, that's not. I also had someone saying, "Is Jack your son?"
Yeah, I've got two sons and 2 daughters.
Now, Jam asked, "Is he writing a book? Any of your children how to go at writing?"
I don't think any of my children know I even write books. If your father's doing it, it must be really boring. So we're going to give it a big swerve. To be honest, I'm sure that a remarkable amount of interest in my work, either in video games or Final Fantasy game books. It's like parents. Well, if it's parents like it, it must be rubbish.
Yeah.
So no, he's not writing a book now.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, well, Ian, thank you so much again for joining us. It's a pleasure seeing you again, and I'll let you get back to the beach and enjoy the rest of your day. But from everyone in the Gamebook community and Gamebook Day, thank you again for your time, and thank you for everything that you brought to us of all ages. And
thank you.
Long may it continue.
During the 38th birthday of Zagor, the Warlock of Phyton.
I'll crack open a bottle tonight.
All right.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.